So some of you who were in the advanced development class last semester have already begun delving into Foucauldian theory, and this semester we'll be staying with some of those ideas as they relate to inclusion in early childhood education. So as we've read this week, French philosopher Michel Foucault is a key thinker in this area of philosophy. He's written extensively on the phenomena and relationship between surveillance, normalizing judgments, and examination. And this is discussed in more detail on page 11 of our textbooks. So he uses the panopticon, pictured here, as a symbol of this social phenomenon of surveillance. So developed in the 18th century, the panopticon was a scheme of the design of a prison where the inmates of the prison were aligned in a way where they would be supposedly observed by a single watchman in the tower without the inmates being able to know if the watchman was there or not. Here there's an assumption that the inmates were always being watched, whether the watchman was there or not, and the surveillance was not something that only came from the watchman, but rather the inmates themselves were active in their own surveillance and subjugation. So this metaphor points to how we as subjects are constantly surveilled, both by others and by ourselves. This surveillance is maintained through public discourse. So we govern ourselves to operate within these discourses and judge both ourselves and others for falling outside of them. So even on very small levels, humans are constantly making small assumptions or judgments that are based on how we assume things ought to be. So in this way, power is not something that necessarily comes from the top down, but rather it's discursive. So it is in constant flux between individuals and society as we ascribe to particular ways of being and judge ourselves in relation to how we're perceived by others. So for me, our subjectivities and minds as educators is an interesting site to examine how power operates and lives within education. For example, here in Ecuador, we're working toward reconceptualizing the early childhood program at the school here in Cuenca, rethinking some of the dominant structures that govern our practices. Yet even with structural and policy change within the school, the logics of previous structures and the ways of knowing children, our roles as educators, is still very much alive in the subjectivities and mentalities of educators and of children. So these structures still live in the mentalities of individuals and assumptions about about who we are and who children are, what counts as appropriate or not, and thus reconceptualization requires close attention and interrogation to the ways in which we think and act as subjects within society. Sometimes these assumptions become so ingrained that we carry them with us regardless of changes in our environment. And sometimes it takes a long time to begin to shift some of these ways of thinking. So from a Foucauldian perspective, power is not something that only exists out there or only in the structures of institutions, but is actively negotiated between these structures and between individual minds and society. So some questions to think with then are, what norms may we be unwittingly upholding? And in paying attention to these norms, what kinds of subjectivities do we want to create space for as educators? So in this week's reading by Carlina Rinaldi, she speaks about the pedagogical possibilities of listening, of suspending common tendencies to fill moments of uncertainty with preconceived assumption. So in this article, she shares a sense of how social constructionism might live pedagogically, how it might inform our ways of seeing ourselves and children and our ways of paying attention. So if truth is not absolute, then how might the act of listening open up spaces for new and multiple ways of seeing and thus knowing, ways of knowing that are hesitant to truth, absolutes, or to a final story. So this article discusses listening as a sensitivity to the patterns that connect, to that which connects us to others, abandoning ourselves to the conviction that our understanding and our own being are but small parts of a broader integrated knowledge that holds the universe together. So in the forum this week titled Provocation, I invite you to select one of Rinaldi's points within the Meanings of Listening section on pages 2 to 3 of her article and write a short 100 to 200 word response that considers the following provocation. How does this notion of listening position you as an educator? And secondly, how does this notion support your emerging social constructionist view of yourself and others? So in other words, I invite you to consider how might listening support a social constructionist view of yourself in relation to others. So the instruction for this week's provocation will also be posted on Moodle, so you'll have it there for your reference as well. And again, if you have any questions or are feeling uncertain about any of the content, please feel free to post in the forums in the general questions section, and also feel free to give me an email and I'm happy to set up a Skype meeting to go through anything with you. Thanks everyone, have a great week.